What you're telling me is that music is about to stop, and we're going to be left holding the biggest bag of odorous excrement ever assembled in the history of capitalism. 1974, 1987, 92, 97, 2000, and whatever we want to call this. It's all just the same thing over and over. We can't help ourselves.
I say when we sell. Hey, I say when we sell.
We just recorded this episode with Robert Breedlove and Bram Constein earlier today. If you follow the show, you typically know that these episodes drop on Fridays, but today's Thursday, and we wanted to release it because as we were recording, Bitcoin crossed 100,000 for the first time since February. And while we broke through six figures mid-recording, the episode was really about much more than price, I would say. We dug into a lot of timely topics, from U.S. states leading the way on strategic Bitcoin reserves to takeaways from the Strategy World Conference to really the broader story of collapse and reconstruction. This episode is about how the failure of the fiat systems opens the door for something stronger, freer, and really more aligned with human flourishing. We talked about how Bitcoin is the solution to inflation, the instability, and the breakdown of trust in society, and ultimately that the people and states that lead with Bitcoin adoption will shape the future of the global financial system. And if you're listening and you're excited about 100K again, I bet it's starting to get your attention, your friends and family, your colleagues, and they're going to need a more secure place to purchase Bitcoin, or maybe you will as well. And so we actually just launched it today, Onramp Trade. It's a new introductory account from Onramp. It's built to support clients from the initial accumulation all the way to long-term Bitcoin wealth stewardship. So if you or anyone you know signs up before June 30th with the code TLT, you'll get zero trading fees through the month of September, 50% off all account fees, and you'll get $50 to $150 in Bitcoin for each person you refer, depending on the account. So start building your position today with confidence. Head to onrampbitcoin.com to open your account, or you can book a consultation to figure out which product is best for you. And we look forward to connecting with you. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Welcome back to the last trade. Yeah, we got five guys, not burgers and fries, but it is the last trade. And so we got Brian Cubellis, Michael Tanguma, Bram Constein, and Robert Breedlove. So Bram and Robert are the guests of honor this week. Gentlemen, thanks for joining the show. Good to see you both. How are you guys doing?
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Really good. Yeah, I'm also happy to be back, guys.
Yeah, great to have you guys on the show today. So what we always do, Bram, you know this because you're somewhat of a regular. Robert, you're maybe not as familiar, but we always pull up the price chart. We start very high time preference and we just work our way lower and lower throughout the show. And so just so everyone knows, the audience knows this was for months. I hated doing this. I didn't even want to do the podcast. I wake up 75K Bitcoin, 80K Bitcoin for months. But now we're at 99K and it feels pretty good. So gentlemen, just general thoughts, sentiment. How are you guys feeling today? Are you guys bulled up? Are you excited? Pumped about the price action, even though I know, we are long-term oriented here. This is a savings technology. It's not a short-term trade, but how's everyone doing? Is this a good vibe or no?
I was gonna say when the price is close to 100K, you can't help but just wake up with good vibes. There was music on this morning. I went into my child's room just blasting stuff. You just start feeling good. And starting this pod, it was pretty exciting. We didn't get to hit record, but when Breedlove and Bram introduced themselves, it was ripping and roaring before they hit record, and it kind of got tempered. So I think we're gonna get a little excited and probably talk about some interesting stuff as this podcast goes. But no, it's incredibly exciting. Obviously, at the end of the day, price is a barometer for awareness, and we're all here to spread Bitcoin awareness. And so as the price goes up, the world can't not afford to pay attention. And so just excited to see it continue going. I think we all agree we're in for a very exciting, at least 6 to 18 months, if not longer. And a lot of things we've been talking about for 5+ years are going to come to fruition, and it's going to be good for the world.
Yeah, I love that. I often don't talk about price on the show because it's the most obvious thing about Bitcoin, right? It's the first thing anyone is going to talk about. But we also forget that like it is the thing that pulled us all in, whether we want to admit it or not. Like, it's the price and the volatility is the first thing that ever made you pay attention to it. I think when you get a little bit deeper into the Bitcoin rabbit hole and you get into Austrian economics, you develop this serious respect for price signals and just how important they are at commanding attention, right? Telling us, what to pay attention to. And so it's strange because my strategy with Bitcoin, as I think most Bitcoiners, mature Bitcoiners share, is you just dollar cost average and try to hold forever, basically. And you can opportunistically buy dips. So when price is down, I don't feel anything. Like I don't feel bad or worried or scared. I'm like actually excited a little bit because I get to hopefully opportunistically buy more. And then when number goes up, obviously you're richer, but it also doesn't feel like much because it doesn't change your pattern of behavior. You're like, oh, great, it's doing what I thought it would do. And so I don't feel a lot actually, and I don't stay too glued to the price. I guess that's kind of the nature of going through 2 to 3 of these cycles now. But it is exciting. I do like another thing to reflect upon is that when that number goes up, it's also like centralized state power going down. So it's a good, as Tanguma said, like a barometer of freedom almost. And so I am, in that sense, very excited that we're pushing new all-time high prices, and we're only probably halfway through this bull cycle.
Yeah, it's really well said. I would just add, like, it's a barometer for freedom. It's a barometer for, in my mind, really the sort of the permeation of education and people waking up to this. So like when we were sitting here for the past 3 months and we were in the 70s and 80s, given all of the sort of hyper constructive tailwinds and bullish news headlines that were happening every day, it just felt off. Like, price should be higher than it is. And so now that we're, back towards 100K and going higher, like it just feels, there's some amount of validation. But I agree with you, Robert. Like, I'm kind of excited when the price goes down because I can acquire more sats for less dollars. But when it's on the way up, it's validating, and it's also just a nice signal that, okay, the education is working, it's permeating, and people are waking up to this idea, and also recognizing the issues with the incumbent system, right? Like it's not only learning about Bitcoin, but it's just seeing the writing on the wall of the fiat system and realizing that there's sort of a renaissance going on in terms of hard assets, sound money, and a lot of that's being led from the United States government, which is kind of insane to think. But yeah, so it's validating, and it's to me, it's just a signal of broader education.
Yeah, I have 2 thoughts here. I think one, years ago we fantasized about the price hitting 100K, right? And I always thought like, okay, 100K is gonna melt the internet. People are gonna lose their mind. And nothing happened. Like literally nothing happened, and then it went down. And I think that's kind of where the challenge is that I think Robert also alluded to a little bit. Like when the price goes up, I'm like, yeah, of course it goes up. But also I'm right. You see, I'm right. But when the price goes down, I think that's where the actual challenge is, right? Like it's a continuous challenge of asking yourself, can I still trust my own judgment on this thing and the research that I did, So I think it's nice that we get a little rewarded. Everyone likes the green numbers and the pump. And so, I think it's good times all around. And maybe this is a bridge, but I don't want to hijack Jackson. But I wanted to ask you guys a question. Where is retail? Like this, is this the meme where everyone's in line at 200K, or like, what are your thoughts?
They're not here. That's definitely for sure.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely not here.
I don't know. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of demand for the Bitcoin Treasury ICOs that have been popping up left and right. These the latest one was it Strive Asset Management? They're launching the first, what they call it, first Bitcoin asset management company, and I'm pretty sure the ticker went up like 500% in 2 days. So I'd imagine a lot of the retail buying is going into these, say, more short-term trades on, let's say, proxy exposure to Bitcoin, and a lot of the underlying asset is being overlooked. And then, of course, as well, the ETFs are soaking up a lot of the retail flows. I actually did see this week that the ETFs, IBIT in particular, surpassed GLD in terms of 2025 inflows. So it's about 7 billion into IBIT, 6.5 billion or so into GLD, which I just think is remarkable. These products have only existed for a little over a year now, and we know that IBIT was the most successful ETF launch of all time. You fast forward to this year, price action hasn't been as exciting, but nonetheless, retail is still buying quite a bit of the ETF price exposure, which as they listen to more podcasts, they check out Bitcoin for Millennials or What is Money, they'll move away from that. They'll figure out what the purpose of actually owning Bitcoin directly is and having it in your control. But we're kind of a ways away from that happening, at least in this cycle.
Yeah, I think the retail activity has been sort of obscured by the ETFs, as you mentioned, Jackson. Like a lot of the capital inflows into those products have just been what you would normally consider retail buying through their brokerage account. And so maybe it hasn't been the same dynamics of retail coming in, but I still think it's relatively tempered to, some sort of euphoric retail mania. Like we certainly haven't seen that.
I think there's an interesting confluence of things happening right now where think about like how many institutions got burned with FTX, and a lot of people just got burned mentally by the industry in 22, and they just think it's all a Ponzi. And I think there's still a lot of institutional capital, and I think by proxy individuals that are just like, this whole thing's a game. I don't know where it's rigged, so I'm just going to stay away. And then also, I guess I don't know, like it hasn't really been that mainstream. I feel like when FTX and things were running in 21 and 2, you saw like the culture had Bitcoin across everything, right? The Miami Heat Arena, like all these things were there versus right now it's been this steady drumbeat, but only in the institutional space. So anybody paying attention to the charts or like a Bloomberg terminal has seen the price. Anybody else, if you go, like I sometimes like to ask, what do you think the Bitcoin price is when you're at the grocer or getting your hair cut? And they're just like, have no idea. And then they hear 100K, they're like, that's insane. So I think that just kind of supports they're definitely not here. But there's always an inflection point where it'll happen. And I think the animal spirits tie into that. When people see that they can grift and make money, then that's when retail naturally steps in, sadly.
Yeah, I think if you ask the man on the street, there's still a lot of generalized ignorance about Bitcoin. It's still looked at as just a speculative investment. That none of the terminology is being used correctly yet. I think people too are also in general desperate under the pressure of inflation. I just pulled up household debt and credit. It's up. Household debt, what's up from total debt? This is consumer debt's up from 14 to 18 trillion since 2020. So, we've been putting on $1 trillion a year. Sure, people are feeling all the pressure of that. Probably generally focused on cash flow producing assets. So, people are trying to stack flats or Airbnbs and do that strategy. And, I think that is just a symptom of not understanding the nature of money and or the financial system. So how are people going to wake up to that? I would assume through a lot of pain, but who knows what form that pain will come in. Presumably continued inflation, possibly global liquidity crisis, and possibly something like a Bretton Woods 2.0. So
it's such a good
pain is coming, that's for sure.
It's such a good point. I think the thing we really forget about how preposterous a notion Bitcoin's value prop really is. Like, like once you see it, it's very hyper intuitive, but until you see it, like what Breedlove just mentioned about cash flow positive real estate, it's like that's what people know is things that are physical that produce other things that you can buy with those paper pieces of money to feed your family. To just say that, well, there's this thing that solves all your problems, or you can buy. And this is where the speculative bet comes in, because at best, initially, people see the price and are just plain, it's like GME or any other ticker. They're just buying the ticker until they go down the rabbit hole. But that ultimately is a different journey for everyone. And sometimes it takes 10 years after the first purchase. So again, that's the angle of this is just going to take so much longer than we all expect because it just takes time.
Yeah, it's the frame of reference. Using the dollar as a frame of reference, that actually takes a long time to decondition yourself from. And we still do. We all still do it, right? The first thing we talked about was the dollar price of Bitcoin. So you got to think about, where we are in the Overton window and where everyone else is. It's quite the journey.
Yeah. Yesterday I had a podcast recording with someone and we talked about how, if you would ask someone on the street, would you rather have Bitcoin or dollars? They would say like dollars because I can touch them. Right. And then we talked about like how that is like the one of the biggest psyops around money is the fact that the money is only real if you can touch it. But when you touch the note and you read what it says, it actually tells you that it's worth nothing. It says that it's legal tender for all public and private debt. So it's so interesting that it's going to take a long time, and I think that's also what is kind of the challenge in Bitcoin, right? Like just keeping our patience. And I wanted to add to I think what Rob said, because I just saw a tweet that said, almost exactly 1 year ago, Jay Powell said, I don't see the stag nor deflation. And today, the Fed's projections anticipate both. This is a timely reminder that we're still grappling with a rare trifecta of macro imbalances. Inflation like the 1970s, government debt levels resembling the 1940s, and equity valuations as stretched as in the late 1920s. None of us own enough hard assets. So I think this is where we're at. And there's not that many people that see it. I think that's also the opportunity that we have here.
It's wild you just brought that up, because we had Larry Lepard and Dave Foley on this week, and they brought up that exact scenario where there was a study, I don't know if it was the 90s or maybe recently, where they gave a kid the option on like San Francisco street, do you want a Hershey's bar or like 10 ounces of silver? And like everyone took the Hershey bar because he could eat it. It's like, what are you going to do with the silver? It's yeah.
Brom, I thought the central planners had it all under control, though. You're telling me they actually don't have the answers for us? They don't have a fix
they're
this
major
issue?
losers who are always late and always wrong, Jackson.
Right. Oh. Fool. Yeah, I think the most recent comment was that Jerome Powell is a fool. One thing on the price, or one other thing on the awareness side, ties into the price, but I like to check this periodically just to get look, it's doing me dirty. The Zyn advertisement's popping up. But I do knickknacks, by the way. Healthier nicotine alternative.
No free ads, Jackson. Come on.
Anyways, I look at this and I see yesterday Alphabet, so Google, had a 8% or so plummet on some, I think it was the first time maybe ever or in a while that Google search volume was down year over year because people are starting to use AI instead of just traditional search engines. And not only that, I believe Apple made some announcement about doing some AI enhanced search capabilities here pretty soon. So you see Bitcoin flip Google in terms of its market capitalization. We're almost at 2 trillion again. We'll be there quite soon. But I almost think this is, the 100K thing is one psychological barrier that's been overcome. But the other piece here as well is, well, Bitcoin's the 6th largest asset in the world. What do you make of that? I mean, that's just insane to me that we're still kind of in this place of very, very low general awareness about what Bitcoin actually is. It's starting to be talked more and more in terms of government, Wall Street, and let's say the people who actually have a closer relationship to the money spigot, and those incentives are going to be aligned in favor of Bitcoin. But the general population is totally unaware that Bitcoin is the 6th largest asset in the world, which I don't know what it takes. Does it need to be number 2 behind gold? Does it need to flip the rest of these equities? I don't know what needs to happen.
Yeah, I use this a lot, actually, when I talk to people that are perhaps a bit older, but I think also our generation, right? When we grew up, it was like, okay, what are like metals that you should have, right? That keep their value. Like we always heard gold and silver. I don't know if you heard that in your youth, but I did, especially people that are older, right? Like that retains its value. But if you look at this chart, you now really have to say it's gold, Bitcoin, and then it's silver, and I love that shift in just the fact that it is like this. It's kind of, I have to think about, for example, if I ask you guys, like, how do you show when you are on the phone, right? Like, how would you enact that? Like you would do this, right? And if you ask that to a small child, they actually do this. So that is something that I'm thinking about is kind of like similar, like that has just changed. And so I think that narrative around gold and silver is also changing. It's very, very slowly, right? But all the young children, maybe teenagers that are growing up right now, like they will become adults in a world where this is the case, and that narrative around like how do you store value will shift eventually.
Yeah, I love that chart. It's just a nice, clean, almost a meme of it flipping these massive companies in market cap, and it's to be fair, it's slightly an incomplete table. Like it should probably also include currencies themselves, which I think Bitcoin is in the range of like 5th to 10th largest currency in the world. So if you added those in there, it would be a little bit more of a complete picture. But yeah, Jackson, to your point, like I think as it continues to just tick up closer and closer to gold and become number 2, it sort of, I think, will be, this meme-oriented gravity around this idea that like, okay, these Bitcoiners have been calling this thing digital gold for a while now. I never really believed it, but okay, now it's like actually jockeying for, gold's place on this chart, and it's surpassed all these other massive companies that historically, sort of, Brom, to your point, like whether it was older generations telling us about precious metals, or in my mind it was sort of like the natural store of value over the past 2 decades were equities, U.S. public equities. And so it's like once it starts to pass all these massive corporations that we've had in our head as how the best performing assets outside of Bitcoin, I think that could flip in some people's brains of like, okay, no, this thing is real. This is all accelerating. Maybe I need to reassess my priors on this.
Yeah, Breedlove, curious on your side of the world. When I think about, like, you've taken an interesting angle as it relates to Bitcoin, but then the adjacent areas that are starting to bleed into it, like holistic medicine, food, which are kind of converging already in the tailwinds of, like, there's just a grand awakening that feels like post COVID, post this new election, and we see it. We're advertisers on your pod, and we get clients that come over, and they're interesting individuals that are regenerative farmers or holistic kind of medicine individuals that are just starting to rethink money and what that is. Like, how do you see that aspect playing into this whole thing? Because it feels like there's this renaissance happening, still at the fringes, but it's starting to come into the mainstream that people understand something's not right.
Yes. There's a lot of people calling this like the Great Awakening. And I would say that's probably I think it's largely driven by this shift in media paradigm, right? We've gone from like a top-down broadcast media paradigm to a peer-to-peer internet media paradigm. We're doing it right now. This changes the whole nature of the way we consume information in terms of both quantity and quality. I think distributed cognition starts to change as a result. So like it was already kind of happening because of the internet. But then COVID's an accelerant to that, right? The state applies pressure. Everyone's stuck at home. Everyone's on the internet. Everyone's putting on their tinfoil hat and going down YouTube rabbit holes. And if you do enough of that, like you often end up at the money, right? Or central banking, and then Bitcoin being a solution to that. So there seems to be kind of this natural affinity between these two changes that are going on, right? You have this shift to kind of decentralized media. And then Bitcoin, is decentralizing the medium of exchange, right? Money itself. And so I don't want to say that Bitcoin is driving the Great Awakening, but like COVID, maybe it's also an accelerant. Like it's not necessarily the pain is what drove people to look at things differently through COVID, but Bitcoin is like this black hole of curiosity, as we all know. Like once you start looking into it, you might initially be reading the Bitcoin Standard and some books about money and economics, but before you know it, that sort of unplugs you from the matrix. I mean, I'm reading books now on and I know Bram as well, like the nature of consciousness and all. It just gets you into the rabbit hole. And so the rough analogy is like, Neo getting unplugged from the matrix, and he wakes up and he sees the reality, right? It's not him walking through a city. It's him wired into this system that is basically harvesting his energy. And when you see that, you start figuring out how to put yourself back together. I don't know, you like take responsibility for life in a really radical way, right? You stop depending on a nanny state or other institutions that are just going to be there for you and take care of you, and it percolates all the way down, right? Like I think Bitcoiners become distrustful of like a lot of legacy financial institutions as part of this journey. So, I think that's got something to do with it. There's also, and you guys already talked about the narrative change. And so there is something about Bitcoin's going through this evolutionary process, right? And we go back to say, well, how did gold become money? And there's an economist named Jevons that said it was a collectible, then a store of value, medium of exchange, and a unit of account. And I think we're just going through that same process that took millennia for gold in hyperdrive for Bitcoin, because we're this global interconnected society. And so you're going to see, I think, Bitcoin is deep and complex, but then it's also radically simple in a way. It's like once you basically get to the conclusion that money printing is bad, well, then you realize that money that nobody can print is good. And so I think that idea, like if I can crystallize it in that few words, I don't see how you could keep that idea restrained or keep it from not propagating through the minds of people over the next 10 to 20 years. And now a lot of people that are skeptical will be like, no, everyone's stupid. No one gets it. Like that's not, it's never going to happen. Every time I hear that, I go back to a quote from some scientist, and he says, science advances from funeral to funeral. So there's this like very serious Darwinian thing going on from a narrative standpoint. And it's, those who pick the wrong savings technology will be eliminated over time, right? It's just, you're either going to die or going to go out of business, basically, or you die poor. And then those who pick the right savings will be imitated over time, right? Those who are financially successful by adopting Bitcoin will be imitated by others. And frankly, I'm a little surprised, like Saylor and Strategy kind of leading the charge on that enterprise front of adopting the Bitcoin standard. I'm surprised we haven't seen more imitation yet. We're starting to see it. But if this bull cycle takes Bitcoin, you guys showed the chart earlier, gold's at 22 trillion, Bitcoin's at 2 trillion. So Bitcoin's roughly 9% of gold. It needs to do an 11x to match gold. That's roughly 1.1 million per Bitcoin. I mean, that's a very reasonable number to see this cycle, frankly. I know that sounds crazy where we are now, but if you look at prior cycles, the 2017 cycle, it did a 20x off its prior all-time high of $1,000. And so if our prior all-time high of this cycle is around 70,000, that if we had the same magnitude, it'd be a $1.4 million Bitcoin by the end of the year. So I know those numbers sound like absurd to people, but just know that we've been here before. And so that's when I think the mania is really going to kick in. When Bitcoin supplants gold and Peter Schiff has to retire and all of this stuff, I think people are really going to get crazy about Bitcoin. And hopefully that will help accelerate the Great Awakening further.
I love that. What I love is that in what you said, right? Like Bitcoin in essence is extremely simple. It's so simple. It's so opposed to the, how do you say, like conjecture, obfuscation, vagueness, abstraction of the fiat money world, right? That once you get it, you would still think like, this sounds too good to be true, but it is true, and once you just accept that, I think that's what actually opens your mind to just be like, what else is obfuscated, abstracted, intentionally kept vague, and that for some people is a trigger to go further down this rabbit hole, right? But yeah, once it clicks and you just realize, man, this is very simple. This is very, very simple, right? Yeah. The only promise of Bitcoin is that it stays the same, and everything else emanates from that, I love that. I love that it's staring you in the face, but you have to do the work.
One thing just to call out, and it kind of helps simplify to everyone's point of like, Bitcoin's not really an IQ test, it's a common sense test of like, if there's a fixed supply, wouldn't you want that? If you ask a 5-year-old, they'd pick that versus an infinite money. But I think it's the notion of, yes, it's happening in real time where money took thousands of years, but also you have these two tailwinds that are converging. So from the top down, we're already going in this direction from like 3 media channels to 5 to 10 to the internet. And so that notion of why everyone's a conspiracy theorist now is because now we just have access to the information. So we're not getting fed the actual narrative. We're not getting fed propagandized narrative.
Yeah.
But then the other side from the ground up, if the money's been messed up forever and that's a substrate of all economic and socioeconomic or coordination, that's being figured out. What that ultimately is, once you see the money, you get to first principles layers of everything. So then you're starting to like, it's just collapsing on itself in two different directions. And that's where you see this like accelerated awakening.
Yeah, I love that. It's Bitcoin is too good to be true, but somehow it's also the most truthful thing we've ever had, which is strange. You know, it's like, and maybe that's why it's hard to accept initially. But then again, you go down the rabbit hole and you realize, oh man, this is the most honest construct, the only social institution humanity has ever created that apparently we ourselves cannot corrupt. And that's a really, really, really big deal.
It's amazing you say that, because that's actually, I think, what keeps everyone away is that we've all been taught if it's too good to be true to stay away from it. And Bitcoin's a get rich slow scheme dressed up as a get rich quick scheme. And people think it's a get rich quick scheme. And so then they just stay away, when in reality, it's just like a paradox built into the underlying that keeps people away.
Yeah. Yeah. It's another one of these cases where Bitcoin is like the unity of opposites in so many different ways. I think it also, like I've said, it radically changes the world simply by being unchangeable. Like we finally have this sort of immovable point. You know, I've analogized it to the number zero, like what zero did to mathematics. I think Bitcoin, 0% inflation money can do for economics broadly. And then the question really comes to like, well, how much does that change us? How much are we, our paths of moral and character development, how much are we just responding to the incentives of our time? And I think Bitcoiners broadly would agree that it's significant, but it definitely remains to be seen. We may be a little bit cultish about this, and maybe some of the implications aren't so radical, but even in just like a purely rational financial sense, it's still the most significant innovation, I think, in history, basically.
I love you hedging that, because I don't think there's a person on this call that would say that we actually probably aren't bullish enough on how much things change because of Bitcoin. Like we just can't even fathom the reality that will exist in 10 years.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we blew Jackson's brain. He was just
there's too much.
There was too much happening there. It was what happened was
malfunctioning.
What happened was Jackson, Robert, and I don't know if Ram, you know this, but a couple episodes ago was positing what if we did Bitcoin UBI, and we had to quickly explain how that would not work. But I think that part of his brain was being triggered by the knowledge of what we're talking about here, and it was just too much to
That's actually a great segue, though. Ironically, because one thing I did want to talk about was state adoption. And so the context of my UBI comment was maybe less about the idea, but more so about the principles of states using Bitcoin to enhance and improve the lives of their constituents. And so that's ultimately the direction I hope it goes in. I don't necessarily think that the federal government or state governments, they haven't had a great track record of doing the right thing for their constituents. But that said, Bitcoin does present an opportunity if used properly by the states, i.e. having a strategic Bitcoin reserve to potentially improve the financial situation of the constituents. Maybe it means less taxes that they have to impose on the people within their jurisdiction. I think that this is incredibly exciting. I know there's a camp within the community or the ecosystem of Bitcoin that doesn't want the state to be involved at all, but I think reality is Bitcoin is for everyone. And so what we're seeing now is there are nations stepping in, the U.S. being one of them, really leading the charge. And then within the U.S., you have states. And so just this week, there's some news that might be worth discussing or just getting thoughts in terms of state adoption. So New Hampshire was the first state to actually pass a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill, which I think is interesting because Bretton Woods happened there 80 years ago. And so I wonder if this is kind of history rhyming in the sense of New Hampshire is it's not a big state. It doesn't have a massive economy, but that really isn't the point of Bitcoin. Anyone can adopt Bitcoin and can use it to improve the lives of their constituents. And so I'm excited about this. It actually does allow for potential other digital assets, which It's not surprising. I think people are still trying to come up the curve on where the signal is versus the noise, but it allows for allocation of public funds into precious metals as well, and then also digital assets with a market cap greater than 500 billion. So that's only Bitcoin. I think it allows for up to 10% allocation of the state's general fund. And then we saw a couple other things as well. I'll rattle them off and then want to get the group's thoughts. So Arizona was first vetoed. The governor actually first vetoed the bill, but then I think yesterday allowed for, or actually passed a bill to allow for unclaimed property of Bitcoin and shitcoins. I saw airdrops in there. It's like, oh, yeah, we have these SUI airdrops. What are we going to do with this?
They're required to stake the assets, just in case anyone was wondering.
Yeah. And so that was one of the other ones. Florida this week, I think, withdrew their strategic Bitcoin reserve. Unfortunately, I think it's indefinitely postponed was the language that was used. And then I believe just this morning, Texas, the bill there cleared the House committee and is heading to a final vote. So pretty exciting news. We've been talking about state strategic Bitcoin reserves for on and off throughout the year, but it's nice to see that the first one has actually been passed and enacted, and I think it'll ultimately be a catalyst for more game theory.
Yeah, it's all very interesting to me. I think, when we got sort of the federal government establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve, while they still haven't fully followed through on that, we still haven't gotten the audit of how much Bitcoin we hold, which is kind of strange. I think what that did is it really provided air cover to all the state legislatures. And, really this has only been happening in earnest for a few months. And I think given, what you would normally think of sort of a government-led, very bureaucratic process, like I think what we've seen is actually pretty incredible in terms of the speed of some of these processes. There's, if you look at that map on bitcoinlaws.com, like there's a lot of stuff happening across the country, all at different stages. And, it's not to say that these are all going to get passed. But it is pretty remarkable to me that, these things are advancing forward, and we're really only a few months into this being an acceptable thing to even think about. And so, yeah, it's very fascinating to me. And it also makes sense that, maybe the states would sort of, get ahead of the federal government and move a little bit faster. Like that part also is logical to me. But it's a good point in terms of, looking at the fine print of a lot of these bills, and how they're structured, whether they have a sort of a deep understanding of Bitcoin versus the rest of digital assets, for one, how they're going to actually execute and implement these reserves. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of, how are they going to custody the assets, is just one element. So there's a lot of work to be done, but as I reflect on it and like the span of time that this has happened, it is actually pretty remarkable given what we know about governments.
I think the irony that we can find is that, like Robert said at the beginning, we all came for the money, right? We came for the profits, and I think the use case is articulated. When people do these testimonials for boards or local government, but eventually the use case of not getting poor and hopefully getting a bit richer is the prime use case for now, I'd say, right? And so what I like is that governments are interested in it and then adopting it, and we can have a whole discussion about should we have centralized government, etc. But eventually this is a Trojan horse, I'd say, because once Bitcoin has established itself, you cannot argue against the principles and values that emanate from it, right? So once you've profited from it as a local, or maybe a local government or a country, changing course and like totally abandoning it at one point because you are from some sort of political background or philosophy that thinks Bitcoin is stupid, then people have already seen what it brought your local government or your country. And so that's kind of how I view it, as this Trojan horse. It's like, yeah, once it's in there, it's going to be hard to turn around, especially when there's also competition between countries and states in the US, right? Like, it's going to be harder to argue to drop Bitcoin after you've adopted it. Like now, of course, governments argue, and we've seen many examples. Also this week, in England, they dismissed Bitcoin. And so we'll see. But I think Robert and I talked about this before. Like Bitcoin is a mirror in that sense. Like once you adopt it, it gives you a happier life and a freer mind, and that is what eventually everyone wants. Including prosperity for a country or local government. So I think it's fascinating to follow the game theory right now. And
I wouldn't rule it out though, Bram, because it's not out of the realm of possibility that a state takes a while, they top tick the market, and then Bitcoin's going down, and then going back to what I just said, like that's why I'm emphasizing, like, do they actually understand what's going on? Because if they don't,
no, they
then
don't.
Then maybe they sell, because it's down 50% and their constituents are angry because why do you guys do this? This is stupid.
I agree, but that would be like a mass awakening over time, right? Because if eventually Bitcoin does go up again, I mean, already it shows, like if the head of the Treasury of the UK and even in Sweden, like 2 weeks ago, no, Bitcoin is too volatile. Like if that is your single argument as the leader of a country's treasury, you have no clue what you are doing. And I'm saying that as a random pleb without any economic or finance background. Like I even understand that is a dumb argument, right? And I don't know, from over time, people will understand that, these people that are ruling you, they have many have no clue.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Bram. And the thing that we're under bullish on is just effectively our ability to impact the world as the price of Bitcoin goes up. We're seeing this today. Think about like what Dave Bailey and other folks are doing in inserting the Trojan horse into the capital markets around Bitcoin Treasury. Like as we get wealthier, not everyone, but a lot of people end up, being able to leverage the principled nature that they kind of found Bitcoin on, and then they want that money is their optionality to affect that into the world, and it lets them have a larger and larger fulcrum. And I think that happens at the individual basis all the way to the nation state basis, and then we talk to them all day long. They're fighting the good fight at these large organizations. Eventually, they're able to either succinctly articulate why they would want to hold it and not sell, or eventually, like to Breedlove's point, they kind of die off and then they're just gone, right? Via like age and actual death, or just their term, and then they leave, and then the next cohort comes in. And it's funny because I'm not overly religious, but like there's stories about this from the beginning of times when you think about like Moses taking people out of Egypt, and then they had to go through the desert for like 40 years before they were allowed to go into Israel, and only the people that understood what was happening were allowed to go in. Like this stuff has just been written over and over, that you have to kind of burn off some of the people that are just never going to get this. But ultimately it will transition to everyone understanding the implications of not holding a harder form of money.
Yeah. Again, I think that's a brilliant like rephrasing of the pain in a way, right? You got to have the occasional forest fire to clear the underbrush and let the new growth come up. I think there's another thing, just to make a distinction between a government and a state. And I know we often use these terms as if they're interchangeable, but I like to try and separate them, because I do think Bitcoin brings us into a world with more government and less, and hopefully no, statism. But just a very simple idea of opt-in, opt-out, that you can opt in, opt out of a government, but a state is something that doesn't allow that, or either, penalizes you if you opt out, for instance. So if you leave the US today with above a $2 million net worth, which in nominal terms is like nothing now, you get hit with an exit tax, right? That doesn't make any sense. That's like if you tried to cancel your, I don't know, home security system, and they come and put a gun to your head and said, no, you got to pay us a few $1,000 for us to take the security system out. Like it's nonsense. And so this idea of, as I forgot who was saying it now, but like the idea that in the US, we still have these vestiges of decentralization from the US Constitution, that we're supposed to have local government power, like, being superordinate to centralized federal state power. That balance has really gotten out of balance with the inception of the Fed, right? Like federal government has grown a lot because well, they've been able to print money and grow unchecked for, well, since 1913, right? We're over a century. And so I think Bitcoin kind of restores that balance. Like we get back to what the spirit of the US Constitution was, which is that we are a constitutional republic. You could say that Bitcoin is making America great again by making government local again. You know, we're actually dealing with people on a face-to-face basis and real political process versus this kind of like row on a spreadsheet mentality you have when you're managed by a centralized government that's, you know, one city, basically DC, ruling 330 million people across an entire continent. That just mathematically, the math doesn't math, basically. And so Bitcoin hopefully pushes us back that way, right? By taking away money printing as a revenue option, it basically will defund and shrink and hopefully eliminate the centralized state, and then we'll be left with local governments, right? And the ability to opt in and opt out of those governance structures. And then you get more of this free market dynamic among governance structures. And I think that's what we ultimately need. I don't think anyone in the world knows what the right or best or optimal governance structure is, but what we do need is a lot of experimentation, trial and error, and freedom, basically, right? Letting people go to where they are treated best. And it's through that discovery process we'll figure out what the right way to organize ourselves is. And that's why I think the United States is kind of leading the charge in some ways, at least at the local level, because we do have this decentralization we've inherited from the US Constitution that a lot of other countries just don't have.
That's a great point, and I'm glad we're having this discussion because that's ultimately what this business and this media that we're building at Onramp is meant to meet the market where they are and try to distill these concepts that are nuanced, because historically in Bitcoin we've conflated what it is to what we perceive the future is going to be, i.e. like no state government, when in reality it's a check and balance on the state government. I think we all agree democracy is great. It's when the money is tied to democracy. And I had just had this conversation with somebody in the Middle East about it's not the nature of church and state are bad. It's when the church and the money got bad together, and then that influenced the state. And so it's just this reality of when you have a check on the money, then the power structure changes between democracy and the end users, the citizens. And it goes back to the self-custody thing that everyone says, well, because you can self-custody Bitcoin, that's the way it's always going to go. And it's like, well, we've had self-custody gold. It didn't work that way because we still want to work we live in a society, like you needed trusted entities. Sounds funny, but like we don't want to live in a world where we have to test our food every time we eat. Like there's still going to be trust in this new world. It's just leveraging the properties of Bitcoin and how you can affect that in the future that is like trust minimized. And so like there's a lot of concepts here that we have to bake out. And I think it's important to talk about because the net new entrants coming in, if we don't do it the right way, we'll just get either funneled into the like herd trap of like an ETF, right? Because if we make it impossible where they have to put their $10 million on a little hardware device, like they either may not adopt it because they rather take their, real estate they can touch, or just go in an ETF that BlackRock uses. In the same way, if we talk about the government's just all going to end, it's like, man, I don't really like that version of the world. Maybe I'm not really buying into it versus there's nuance to all of this and we're going to watch it play out. It's not going to be as drastic as everyone assumes or thinks it will be.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Maybe it's controversial to say, but I've always kind of had the thought that self-custody maximalism is really ETF maximalism, in the sense that there will always be a subsegment of individuals that are technically savvy, have great OPSEC, and the best solution for them is to manage it all within their physical control. But if you prescribe that to the entire market of new entrants, like if I were to tell that to friends and family, which I have over the years, most of them either A, don't take action, they just never start buying Bitcoin because this responsibility seems far too great to them, at least to start. And so B, now there are these financial products, which a lot of people have Schwab accounts or Fidelity accounts, and you can place a trade for zero fees and you can buy a few shares of whatever ETF. And so ultimately that's why, I'm particularly excited about our business, not to shill ourselves, but just a recognition that if you give two people an option of, you got to manage this all yourself, you have nothing to fall back on, or you just buy something, it's exposure, at least maybe you can protect your wealth and, escape debasement. but you might not actually have control of it. You might have some counterparty risk. Well, in fact, you definitely have counterparty risk. Then people will still go for that option. So I just think it is about building out the market structure, helping Bitcoin to continue to grow and be adopted at the rate that we want it to. And so that's ultimately what I'm excited about.
Yeah, I could jump in with one of the. This kind of ties back to something Tanguma was saying earlier. Just where you were talking about it being kind of like bottom up and top down at the same time, and that Bitcoin is, again, by, let's say, broadly defunding the centralized state. You could be more specific and say defunding the central bank, right? Just eclipsing money printing as a revenue option for the centralized state, which is basically a mechanism of unlimited growth, right? There is no check or balance on that ever. There's been a lot of examples about this. I think Safety cited the example of in Lebanon, there was still, a train authority or something like that, and there hadn't been any tracks of train in decades. There's like, you get weird. There's no selection pressures being applied on some of these government agencies that can just print money because they literally incur no losses, right? There's no accountability to a P&L. So you get this just like endlessly growing central government. And so if Bitcoin's defunding that, you're defunding the propaganda apparatus of the centralized state, but it's also in a bottom-up way. It's the Bitcoin curious or the people going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. You also sort of start to inoculate yourself against propaganda and psyops. You start to see it for what it is. So like, not only is it getting defunded, but people are also waking up to the earlier point of the Great Awakening. And so, Nietzsche said that everything the state has is stolen. Everything it says is a lie. It's like Bitcoin starts to basically put light on that. And I think, there were 1 million man protests going on worldwide right before March 12th, 2020, global COVID lockdown started. Right? There's already awakening and movement to the tune of 10 million plus people in the streets. Now, is that causative? You go down that rabbit hole separately, but like there's already this momentum, basically, people saying these systems don't work broadly. And so now you couple that with this free flowing of information. And I think the truth is really hard to hide ultimately in this day and age. And so, as people figure this stuff out and then people start to dip their toe into Bitcoin, they start to figure out the value prop, like, oh, hey, I actually do need to custody this in a risk minimized way, right? Wherever you want to fall in that spectrum, whether you're the radical anarcho-capitalist doing it all yourself, or you're doing like collaborative institutional custody as you guys do. I'm not sure if I'm using the exact right terminology that you guys prefer, but breaking the key amongst a few different institutions, you're inducing this sort of transition for people to take on more radical responsibility for their purchasing power and less abdication of that responsibility to custodians, to nanny states, whatever. So like this is the transformation, right? It starts to empower people to take charge of their lives, I think. And, when people are in desperate situations or they're being oppressed or they're in a lot of economic or socioeconomic pain, this ability to take radical responsibility for yourself is like one of the most incredible benefits you can possibly have. So I do see it as the state, and this is kind of ironic, right? But I think the centralized state ends up orange pilling more people than anyone by like orders of magnitude. They're just going to do what they do. They're going to oppress and steal and lie. And people are going to keep, as they squeeze, people keep sliding between their fingers. And those people that slide between their fingers into the bright orange future will succeed financially and whatnot. And then those that are still in the grip of the state are going to start to imitate those that are not. And over time, this thing just dissolves and you get, again, more localized governance and hopefully a lot more human freedom.
Yeah, I know before we jumped on, it's well said. Brom, Parker and I used to work together and we'd go out to meetings and you have no shortage of folks that would bring up, well, the state's going to stop it, right? And it's like, well, Prohibition lasted for however long it did, and they couldn't stop the flood of, or the flow of booze. And Bitcoin is infinitely more valuable to the individual than booze will ever be. So what would you expect? I mean, it's not as tangible, right? It flows over the cyberspace. So to read those points, like, yeah, this thing just goes down like water, or gravity. It's just a matter of time as it, and it's just accelerating basically.
Yeah, and we already saw that China could not stop Bitcoin mining, right? Like it puts a blip in the hash rate, and then you see this kind of amorphous, nebulous nature of the Bitcoin mining network. It's like, okay, well, we can't mine here anymore. Put these little things in a box and ship them somewhere where we can mine, plug them back in. And that's literally what happened, right? Blip in the hash rate, and then it rebounded strong. And so if China, which is the most brutal authoritarian regime in history, so far as I can tell, can't stop the most physical aspect of Bitcoin, which is Bitcoin mining, then what government or state, more specifically, is going to do anything to stop this? It just doesn't seem possible.
Just a quick break from the episode. We just launched Onramp Trade today, actually. So if you're listening to this on Thursday, May 8th, we just launched Onramp Trade, a new account tier designed to support individuals from their first Bitcoin purchase to long-term wealth stewardship and accumulation. As part of our launch promotion, if you sign up before June 30th with the code TLT, you'll receive 0 trading fees through September, 50% off account fees, and $50 to $150 in Bitcoin for each person you refer. So whether this episode has you feeling bullish and you want to buy some more, or your friends and family are going to start asking because 100K Bitcoin has their attention, you know where to go. Head to onrampbitcoin.com to open your account or book a consultation with our team. Looking forward to meeting you. On that note as well, though, 100 years ago with 6102, it was estimated to be about 25% of private gold that was actually seized by the government, right? So then now you have a digital asset that lives everywhere and nowhere at the same time, that you can get on a plane, train, get in your car, be in a different jurisdiction in a very quick time relative to 100 years ago. So imagine just like the success rate of a government trying to your point, Robert, couldn't even do it with China and mining with physical hardware, but how about the digital asset itself? It's like virtually impossible.
And the wild part about all this is, like, have you guys ever seen something where the incentive alignment happens at the most micro and macro level at the same level of game theory, where to the point of like you can't ban Bitcoin or Bitcoin mining, you can only ban your country from participating, and that and we've seen this play out. I believe it was India and China that went, when the world went to a gold standard, went to a silver standard, and their countries paid the cost for that for 50 to 100 years. And so that's what everyone's going to have to make the decision on, from a micro level and how you feed your family, all the way to a macro level and how you protect your citizens. And there's precedent for that. And so people are going to make certain decisions, but there's going to be like ramifications for the wrong one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, number of things there. Yeah, Executive Order 6102. Most of that was seized from centralized custodians. Like they didn't go door to door, right? When the cost of enforcement gets so high, like you got to remember that the state is too a business, right? They're in the business of killing, stealing, and destroying. So if they can steal, they can get a lot more juice for the squeeze and just steal several depositors' gold from one institution. That's the one throat to choke kind of thing, whereas going door to door actually increases their cost of enforcing that executive order. So in 1933, that's what you saw. They basically went to central custodians and seized some of this gold. They did not go door to door. Not to mention all of the political revolt you would likely see in a scenario like that, especially in a country where gun ownership is so high, especially in red states. So, and yeah, I actually didn't know that number, that 25% of gold was seized, but I do think it's interesting that is the same amount roughly that central banks hold today. They hold about 25% of the global gold supply. Not that it was all seized in that way, but just an interesting number. Seems like maybe that's kind of the sweet spot. They need to corner the market, so to speak. And then to Tanguma's question, I think the only similar game theoretic alignment between the individual and collective like that is something like that. I think the Hindu Arabic numeral system is a good example of that, where merchants that used zero-based numerals could outcompete those that did not. So they're basically running a better accounting software, if you will. And so obviously individual merchants are forced to adopt that if they want to outcompete others. but then it becomes a matter of collective interest as well, because if your country is not using the right mathematics, then you can't even have import-export relationships with other countries and whatnot. You can't even actually, we would not be able to wage war against them as effectively either, right? All of these, ballistics mathematics and all these other things, these require Hindu Arabic numerals, zero-based numerals to be more specific. And so it's very much a do or die. And I think that's such an important point. People often describe money as a belief system, or like, oh, it's all subjective and we can just choose whatever we want. Like there's some truth to it, and that it is selected subjectively, but the consequences are objective, right? Like you choose the wrong thing, you get outcompeted, you go out of existence. And so there's this game theoretic process that leads to a definitive conclusion. And, I don't like to use the word inevitable because that's very strong of a word, but like if Bitcoin continues to exist, I have yet to hear any intelligent counter argument as to why it would not become the world's money, right? It's affording individuals and collectives the most optimal properties of money. And it's very much like that zero-based numeral system. It's like you either adopt this thing and enjoy the efficiency gains from it, or you will go out of existence in X number of generations. So,
this is
something
what
to reiterate.
Yeah, sorry, Rob. I think this is what Safedine talks about with the gunpowder.
Yes.
Like if someone shows up with gunpowder and you're like, oh, is that environmentally friendly? Like, how is that great? Boom, you're dead. It's like there's no space. There's no space for discussion. And that's what I said before is like Bitcoin is a mirror. Some people will adopt it and some people won't, and you will see a difference in what it brings these people. And you can keep ignoring the change that's literally happening right in front of you. And I'm thinking about something that Michael said. I think it was Michael who said that before, but I really think this is, Rob didn't want to say Bitcoin is inevitable, but I'm thinking like there's a reason why Bitcoin exists right now, right? Like it's there's a parallel with AI, for example, and they are converging. Actually, the third road, I would say, is the more like global awakening, people waking up more into consciousness. Like all these things are like converging into a single point. And so I'd even say that Bitcoin is necessary to profit from the technological advancements that are coming at us in a faster and faster way. Like how else, this is what Jeff Booth, I think, told me. How are you going to measure the extreme deflationary effects of AI with money, by pricing it with money that's inflationary? Like you're betting against yourself or shooting yourself in the foot, or however you want to say it, right? Like the technology is here, but you cannot profit from it because you're dumb enough to still price it in the money that's dying, like it's, and I think eventually it's human nature. Like people will gravitate towards this because we all want to have an improved life, better productivity. I think that in general is the whole purpose of what the humans are doing, right? And so, if you are short yourself by not being able to adopt, I think the most mind-blowing technology that's going to be introduced in humanity, then there's no logical conclusion or argumentation that would substantiate that choice, I think.
And what's fun about this timeline is that, because I think, Breedlove, you've probably been doing this the longest from, I don't know if pontificating is the right word, but educating, I guess, on the way that this works. And we're living in the timeline in real time. I don't know if, Jackson, it's a good transition to like the strategy world and all the stuff happening there. Like, I'm not the biggest bull on corporate, running SPACs to buy Bitcoin, but there's still something there that ties into all of this, in the objective reality that what we're talking about here is starting to integrate into the S&P 500, integrate in public companies, and they're starting to slowly, it's still early, but not only are they realizing they can add Bitcoin and increase the amount of access to capital, but you can start to squint and see how they'll be penalized if they don't hold Bitcoin in their treasury, especially as the price appreciates. And this game theory is starting to insert itself into publicly traded companies, that they're going to have to figure out their Bitcoin strategy, or they're going to get penalized from their stock price, which is just insane to think about, because a year ago it would have been crazy to say, and definitely 5 years ago that would have been just complete taboo to reference.
I was going to say another component, kind of like zooming back to where we started the conversation around like why number go up is actually very important, is because everything we just talked about, like this, radical awakening, realizing it's do or die, like it takes time to get to that point. Like that is a process. Whereas, if you look at the corporate adoption is one element, or like, there was a news item this week of Brown University allocating to Bitcoin, very small. I think it was 0.07% of their portfolio, about $5 million US. They're not viewing this as, dismantling the state, right? Like they are probably still viewing it largely as a trade. And I think the reason, they're able to do it now is going back to like the air cover, the narrative changing, the Overton window shifting to where, they are very aware of the fact that Bitcoin is the best performing asset of the past 16 years. But it's had this sort of shroud of toxicity around it, and they haven't been able to allocate to it as part of a broader portfolio. I think now that shroud is sort of lifted, and the Overton window has materially shifted to where the United States government is calling it a strategic reserve asset, I think that really opens the window to people being able to interact with Bitcoin as, first and foremost, like number go up technology. And I think that's just sort of the first stage, as we all know, and then you go deeper and deeper and understand the longer term implications for society and everything else. But I think it's just worth pointing out that like we're still very early in like the broader public getting to where we are and everything we just talked about for like the past 15 minutes. For the foreseeable future, it's going to be number go up that get people excited about this, and really the large coffers, the large swaths of capital around the world that are still on zero. The way they're going to get off zero is not by thinking the state is going to be dismantled. It's going to be, okay, now I can allocate to this thing that's outperformed everything else in my portfolio. It probably makes sense for me to have at least some allocation. And this, it's interesting that the Brown allocation was interesting timing, because last week I caught up with an old colleague from my private banking days who's now works on the investment team at a college in Boston. And she was always very skeptical about Bitcoin. But I think I made more headway with her this time than I ever had before. One, because I had 5 more years of sort of evidence on my side. But the other component was I just kind of left her with, if you guys as an endowment have zero exposure, you're effectively short. Like if you take 2 trillion out of the 900 trillion, 0.2%, you have zero, you're short. And so, if you look at what Brown just did, 0.07%, they're still kind of short. But, if Bitcoin appreciates and they don't rebalance, they're going to be right sort of at the global aggregate exposure. And so I think it's just worth sort of pulling back and realizing like we're much farther down this rabbit hole than the vast majority of people on Earth. And, number go up is going to be a big component of why people adopt over the near term.
Yep. The Brown investment team hasn't spoken to Michael Saylor yet. So they'd be like, how much Bitcoin do I buy? And he says, well, all of it, right? I think that's what he said in one of his presentations this week. I know we're coming up on time. One thing I just wanted to touch on very quickly was some of the bullet points here in one of Saylor's presentations this week. I think this applies to companies as well. It applies to endowments and foundations, but ultimately the most important thing I take away from this is for the individual, because the individual at the end of the day is looking to preserve their wealth for the long term. And at least here in the United States, the mechanism for doing that for certainly the top 10%, but even like the top 50% that might have some, 401k exposure is through equities. And I think this is just a staggering number where over the past decade, only 15% of companies actually beat the S&P 500. But more importantly, 96% have underperformed T-bills. And so in Saylor's presentation, he talks about the wealth being generated by only 4% of the companies in the index. And so my concern is people have become investors out of necessity to preserve their capital. It's not that they want to be thinking about portfolio allocation and having to do this. And a lot of times they'll outsource it right to a financial advisor to help with this. But Bitcoin at the end of the day is just, for us, it's a savings technology. It's allowing us to focus on whatever else that may be, whether it's spending time with family, focusing on improving your health, whether it's building a business. And you're able to just save for the long term without having to be, an investment professional for your own finances. And so this has been an issue for a while, concentration, but I think it's particularly a good time to revisit and call it out because tech stocks in the US have been quite volatile. I mean, even just yesterday we talked about how Google was down 8% in a day, right? So people always love to talk about and try to discredit Bitcoin because of its volatility. Well, A, it has more good days and bad days in terms of volatility, but B, even people who are parking all of their wealth or much of their wealth in an S&P 500 have like typically 30% or so of that index is in 7 companies that are really driving the performance of the total index. So at the end of the day, this is a problem because I think investors don't fully appreciate, or savers, let's call them savers, don't fully appreciate just how much of their retirement and their family's livelihood is riding on the success of about 5 companies, a half dozen companies. So that's very problematic. This is ultimately a big piece of why Bitcoin is so important for the individual, is because you don't need to worry about Google searches going down year over year and how that might impact your retirement. You're able to preserve your wealth out of dollars, out of euros, into a harder form of money that cannot be debased, confiscated from you, and you don't rely on the earnings or the revenue growth or the search volume of any one company. You just rely on math, effectively, of just a better form of money outcompeting all other forms of money. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, or if there were anything from the strategy conference this week that you wanted to talk about, but this is just something I think is always important for individuals to pay attention to.
It's a little out of left field, but and I didn't get to see it fully, but I guess Saylor had a discussion point about how he used AI to figure out his new strategy around, like he was inputting. I don't know if anybody saw that, where he was just like he was explaining the prompt he put in about, like, I don't even know, like capital markets accessing some of the like debt and the different covenants. And he said he got it 85% of the way there, and enough to like provide the construct to take to the humans on his team to develop it, which was just like a fascinating, intertwining of all these different concepts we're talking about. You think
Yeah,
about like what would it cost a team to put that together previously, where he was able to do that by spending an hour in front of an AI tool.
I saw that clip yesterday, and then the other thing I took away, there's obviously high leverage in terms of getting it done faster, better. But he was also saying he thought he probably couldn't get it done without the AI tool because there was so much career risk. They wanted to do so many different new things that if you take that to some of these legal and financial professionals, they'd just be like, oh, it's too much. But if you have the AI kind of do all of the prep, that you can present it in a much more palatable way. And that's fascinating to me, right? Like we're already kind of cognitively outsourcing even our most sophisticated business activities. And so how far does that go? It's interesting to think about.
I do think it also ties into what you said before, Robert, about the let's call it democratization of media, right? Like people can find more information online, but also with AI, I think it's democratization of the application of information or knowledge, right? Like I've had conversations with AI where I say like, okay, some people call Bitcoin a Ponzi scheme, but isn't fiat money actually a Ponzi scheme? And then it starts innocent. It says like, oh yeah, that's an interesting thought, etc. No, because blah, blah, blah. It's just a standard programming. But then you're like, okay, but if you print more money to pay the previous debt, and eventually, a government doesn't produce anything and it gets money from the citizens, right? Doesn't that sound like a Ponzi scheme? Yeah, that's pretty, and you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And then eventually, you put it all together and then you say like, okay, compare Bitcoin with these characteristics and fiat money system with these characteristics, like which is the Ponzi scheme? And then the AI says, the fiat money is the Ponzi scheme. And I think over time, and that's a general theme here, I think people will figure out how to get to that information, and people will share this information, in a way more free way. And so I've had an idea for a long time to make a video about this, to then actually share it, right? But I think it's what we're talking about in this conversations. Like it takes some time, but it's happening, and like all the tools are there, all the information is there, and yeah, we'll just have to sit it out, guys. But I think the price going up helps, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think one thing just to call out, because this happened while we were recording, is it was the largest acquisition in the industry to date. So Coinbase had been rumored, but bought Deribit for $2.5 billion. And Vijay Boyapati had a really great quote on it saying, "This is a huge development for the options market. Deribit was one of the largest, most liquid options markets on Earth, but was unavailable to U.S. customers, mostly due to the prior admin. A sea of changes coming to Bitcoin options." Um, and why I mainly call that out is because, there's been this blessing. I think it dates back to the ETF and the integration into the US and just capital markets in general. And so all the things we're talking about here are actually beneath, below the scenes or behind the curtain are effectively like transpiring. They're happening. The banks are starting to work on this. And so I think everything we're talking about, including the AI stuff, is just going to accelerate the next year and beyond.
I do have something on AI I'd like to get in here before we close. I think AI driving prices down is actually going to accelerate Bitcoin adoption. Which could also probably increases Bitcoin volatility, which is, again, just price discovery is the way I look at that. It's not actually, if you think volatility is a bad thing, it's a matter of sizing in your portfolio, right? If it's too volatile, then reduce your exposure. So, and the thinking is this, like basically if you're saving in USD, then all that purchasing power that's accreting to you through AI productivity growth is basically going to be stolen through inflation, right? Because they're trying to keep prices rising in a world where they should be declining, a la Jeff Booth thesis. Whereas if instead you're holding Bitcoin, right, your purchasing power is actually going to accelerate in terms of its growth, because Bitcoin's letting you participate not only in the productivity boom of AI, but really all productive enterprises around the world. It's kind of like, and I've said this before, holding Bitcoin, and you could also say holding physical gold is something like this. It's like holding a non-counterparty index fund on all global wealth creation. So anyone, anywhere that increases the output of goods and services, that accretes to your purchasing power as a saver. And in a way that's non-counterparty, right? You're just holding the actual gold or the Bitcoin in this case. And so as Bitcoiners, as a result of AI causing productivity to accelerate, I think that causes Bitcoin's purchasing power accretion to accelerate. And as Bitcoin holders are getting richer faster, you're going to see more people imitating their strategies more intensely, again, at the individual level up to the business and probably the nation state level for that matter. And so I think it's really important for people, I don't know who listens to this pod, but if you're like, you think you're late to Bitcoin or whatever, just realize that everyone has had to, Bitcoin's often described as an ego test. Like if you didn't get it or you resisted it before, at some point you have to be humble enough to say, hey, I was wrong. Actually, this is a big deal. I need to have some exposure to it. And yeah, to take that back to our point earlier about kind of its, again, I don't want to use the word inevitability, but let's say high probability. You could either choose to be humble and take the orange pill voluntarily now, or you can forcibly take the orange suppository later. You really have to make the decision. So, yeah.
All right, guys, we've talked for long enough, just long enough for Bitcoin to hit 100K while we're talking.
Let's go.
Did it do it?
Oh, you
It
called
did.
it.
Fire.
There we go. Wow. We're
Back,
back.
baby. Back,
Oh,
baby.
I'm
Isn't it-
happy it still shows above 100. Yeah.
It's one of those memes where they show like, when it first crosses, the person's happy, and then you come back to that number and everyone's disheveled and just like got hit by a car. It's like, 5 months ago we hit it, we feel good. Now we're back. We're like, shit, man, because it, bottom tick the 74 or whatever. But yeah, that was really well put. I think like Breedlove on the deflation in AI. There's the other angle, and they basically converge to the same point of when people are investing in capital goods, and deflation naturally is going to lower the cost of production. Well, those capital goods or the investment is going to reduce the return profile and sometimes be zero. We've seen this. I think it came out where like was it Dollar General? One of them sold for like 18 billion previously, and then like just got bought for $1 billion. Like 17 billion goes away. Like that's just destruction. And you see the OpenAI and then DeepSeek. And so at the end of the day, it all comes back to gold and Bitcoin are going to be ultimately understood as money and everything else as credit. And that's like this emperor has no clothes moment. We're on stocks and bonds where the powers that be have been okay with propagating that, but people are waking up. And I think a function of them waking up is just the sovereigns are now saying that gold and Bitcoin are money, and they're usually the tastemakers for the world. And so, yeah, deflation and AI are going to just help accelerate everything we're talking about here. This was a fun one, guys.
This was
Agreed.
great. Thanks.
Michael, did you
And we're
want to
not going
chat?
back. Well, just to for Brahms' sake, like we're not going back, okay? We're going up, and we're just going to go to the right. Everyone on Twitter says that we're never going below the next, number. So hopefully this time's true. Jackson was going to reference, yeah, very quickly. Super excited. Well, first to start with Brahm and Breedlove being believers in what we're building. They're proud sponsors of Onramp. Was exciting to have them join because they're friends, but also to talk about this stuff. But we announced today the launch of Onramp Trade, and why that we think that's important is because ultimately, what's baked into all this conversation that people don't always talk about is they believe Bitcoin's a Ponzi or speculative because they hear the common trope that Bitcoin ends up in a landfill in the UK or it gets taken by North Koreans. And so they just assume that even if they figured it out and understood what we said, now they have another problem. It's like, what do I do with it? And that's why we think multi-institution is so transformative for the industry because it democratizes the access to like material exposure without having to go through 5 years of figuring out self-custody and collaborative custody. With all that said, most people aren't really ready even for that. As we know, they're just trying to find their first existing exposure. So we launched Onramp Trade to let individuals and their friends and family really, and let's say everyone listening to this gets this, but their friends and family, they know that wherever they start is probably not their end journey because historically in Bitcoin, like all of us have had to play hot potato with the asset. You start at X, then go to Y, then end up in collab, and then end up in an ETF because you're afraid of it. We're really excited to launch a like end-to-end suite where people can get onboarded in the lowest cost way to Bitcoin and buy, as much as they need, but then ultimately migrate over to financial services around multi-institution custody. So super pumped to do that. The pitch we're making is we won't be beat on cost. So anybody gets somewhere else that says, hey, lower fees, come to us, we'll reduce it. And the reason why is because we have a business model that relies on custody. So we're not we think it's easy to buy Bitcoin. It's hard to hold it. And nobody tells this story. Everyone likes to say like, we offer the lowest trading, but they don't give anybody a good solution to long-term store it. And as we all know, the easy part is actually buying it. It's the hard part of like actually custodying and having conversations like this that can reinforce the conviction. So we're excited to announce it, excited to have you guys as partners and see where it goes as the funnel grows, where people don't have to go through this long, arduous journey of getting to this position. Ideally, we can distill that and make that like signal tighter for somebody coming in, preserving their wealth, passing it to generations, and then just going back to their day-to-day lives.
I think it's
guys.
fantastic.
Congrats.
Yeah, the custody problem is the problem, right? Like you said, anyone can buy it, but then you get into the realization that you can't just leave it with a centralized custodian. You've got to do something better than that, and that's actually very complicated. So making that easy for people, that's a very important mission.
Yep.
Yeah, and just to add, it's easier than ever to sign up for OnRamp. You can actually go through a self-service onboarding flow now, so you don't even need to have a consultation with us, and you can have an MIC vault set up in a matter of minutes, which is pretty remarkable when you think about what's going on the back end, the coordination of 3 different institutional key holders coming together to create a segregated vault for you, with full transparency and auditability. So easier than ever to get access to really the best form of Bitcoin custody in our minds. And even if you're not ready for that, you can come into our orbit through OnRamp Trade. And really, as Michael pointed out, like OnRamp Trade will be a great venue and avenue to refer friends and family to, colleagues who need to know they need to get off zero effectively, but they want to do it in a trusted place where they actually have line of sight to long-term security without having to hop around all different platforms.
And there are no coincidences. We launched it on the day Bitcoin's going past 100K again. So anybody signing up, including you guys as friends and family, 0 fees until October. So which is exciting. We're just going to say, like, you sign up, you get access, no trading fees. So appreciate you guys joining and excited to see what the rest of 2025 has in store for everyone.
Thanks,
you, guys.
gentlemen.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, boys.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the show. If you found the information valuable, please share the episode with a friend or leave a rating on your favorite podcast app. All the links we discussed in today's show will be in the show notes inside your podcast app. Before we finish, a quick reminder that Onramp Media is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and nothing should be construed as investment or legal advice. Regardless of where you are on your Bitcoin journey, we'd love to hear from you. Visit onrampbitcoin.com/contact to schedule a consultation with one of our private client advisors.